the heart of Central Florida, you're listening to the most electrifying show in media. A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, your neighbor, David Gornoski. So glad to be back with you again across FM and AM around Central Florida and Tampa Bay and worldwide on our website, neighborschoice.com. Happy to have an opportunity to roll up our sleeves and solve problems neighbor to neighbor. That's what you've come to expect on this broadcast, and that's what we'll get. Something different, something a little bit, I would say, fresh, right? Because the same old left versus right thing is played out. It's boring. It's microwaved. It just doesn't have the energy behind it anymore. We need something different, something more interesting, something deeper, and yet more common sense at the same time. Because the truth isn't about complicated theories or ideologies. It's about what's right. It's about what's real. It's about what has skin in the game. Politics is all about not having skin in the game. It's all about taking credit for things you didn't do and obfuscating responsibility for things that you did wrong. It's the opposite of a skin in the game society. And yet we keep turning to it because we feel trapped in a mental prison that says, well, I know it's all crooked, but what else are we going to do? Well, you have to remember, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be someone who wants to do great things? What does it mean to have an American self-reliant spirit? Discover what those things actually mean. Don't have your history given to you on a silver platter by psychopaths who want to divide you against people by altering the facts of history. Rather, pursue the truth yourself. And remember what it is you were supposed to be, who you were supposed to be. It's something that we would do well to do the sooner rather than later. I saw a story from Metro headline. The mystery of Japan's sacred mummified mermaid is finally solved. This little baked out little mummified body of a mermaid was stored at Injuin Temple in Asakuchi, Japan. And Jeff Parsons does this story here. The tale of an ancient mummified mermaid has finally been resolved after scientists spent the last year studying it. Allegedly caught in the Pacific Ocean off the Japanese island of Shikoku between 1736 and 1741, the creature has been worshipped for hundreds of years. According to folklore, the 30-centimeter tall creature grants immortality to anyone who tastes its flesh. The creature has two hands reaching up towards its grimacing face. Hair is still visible on its head, and it has the remains of sharp, pointy teeth in its mouth. But its body gives way to a distinctly fish-like tail. Scientists have puzzled over the finding, which usually rests in the Injuin temple, for years. It's unclear how or when the mummy came to the temple, but Chief Priest Kozen Kyuda said it was put on display in a glass case some 40 years ago and is now kept in a fireproof safe. We have worshipped it, hoping that it would help alleviate the coronavirus pandemic, even if only slightly, he told the Asahi Shimbun, a Japanese newspaper. However, over the last 12 years, researchers have subjected the mermaid to a battery of tests to determine if it's an organic creature or not. They use CT scans and other high-tech tests to determine that, sadly, the creature is completely artificial. They discovered the mermaid was made of paper, cloth, and cotton, with no evidence of any skeleton at all. And while the scientists did find some animal remains attached to the figure, they determined these had been added by whoever created it. The lower half of the body does indeed come from a fish's tail or fin. Meanwhile, its jaw and teeth are also taken from a fish, while the fuzz on its head originally came from a mammal. Radiocarbon dating shows that the subject dates back to the late 1800s, which fits with the team's initial estimations for when it was made. You know, what's interesting about this story just is look at what they say about it. I've taught you a lot about anthropology and applying it to current events to understand why we do what we do. Remember I told you yesterday there's rise of these animals, these stuffed animals and cartoons with monstrous mergers of animals. You know, they've got animals and cartoons now where it's a baboon face mixed with an elephant mixed with a crocodile. These are always anthropological signs of a monstrous merging of identity to the sense of chaos that was being reflected by these symbolic figures. And when you see that these people in Japan, some were still worshiping this so-called mummy, this little mermaid creature. It was a double, right? A monstrous, undifferentiated symbol. And yet, it's almost like that becomes, okay, a something that somebody wants to, according to the folklore, grant immortality to anyone who tastes its flesh. We've seen the rise in trying to normalize the taboo of cannibalism in recent pop culture movies and TV shows. I've told you before that that's a desire for someone else's being, somebody else's status, somebody else's special status that you feel you don't have and you desire and you want. And it's in its most grotesque and direct and ugly form, but it has its own way of kind of undergirding so much of what we do when we want to keep up with the Joneses. We want to have the same car as somebody else. We want to, now it's become normalized that you have to change the gender to somebody else to be like them, right? Constant competition merges the competitors into a sameness. A merging of identity and distinctions blending into one. And I've told you that these gods, these symbols, were worshipped. And here you go. They were worshiping in Japan this little mummy they thought was real to alleviate the coronavirus pandemic. And how many folks still worship politicians who are able to do things that they believe demand respect and authority, that they can command economies, that they can shut down businesses, they can shut down whole nations, they can shut down airlines, they can shut down military members by forcing them to take a product they don't want that injures people by an unprecedented level. And yet here in Japan, in that story, they're worshiping what they thought was a mummy of a mermaid as an icon of undifferentiation, which is a sign of a God that is going to be able to stop the undifferentiation of a pandemic. The undifferentiated social decay where everybody's fighting against everybody until they get locked up into a contagion of groupthink solidarity, and then they go off and eliminate people who threaten that solidarity by socially ostracizing them, harming them, gleefully demanding that they not have access to ICUs, as late night hosts were doing during the pandemic to people they didn't like, the people that didn't mimetically submit to the groupthink. See, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Japan is a society that has not been quite as infected with the story of the cross of Christ to the same deep level that the West has. And so you can see the sacred in its more direct form in these little kind of folklore traditions that still cling into Japanese culture, despite it embracing and imitating a lot of the modernism of the West, industrialism, technology, technocracy of the West, atheism of the West. There's still a deep respect for tradition. And I believe precisely because of its lack of infection with Christianity taking root into its culture at a deep, deep level, you can see people still worshiping what they thought was a mummy to get rid of the pandemic. But that gives you a tell as to what it is that they're trying to stave off. You know, people used to worship Cyclops, or, you know, they used to worship gods that were merging with animals all over the time in ancient communities to stave off a plague. Hercules was worshipped in a sense, or given tribute to, in the story of Apollonius of Tyana, a pagan miracle worker in the, I think it was a 3rd century AD, where you have a story of Apollonius of Tyana coming to the city of Ephesus, and there's a plague, and the people were concerned. But the word plague didn't always mean just a disease. It also could mean social dysfunction, social distrust, and loss of identity and sense of self. Rivalry, run amok. Envy and hatred, run amok. Sound familiar? Resentment, run amok. Dysfunction and disorder, spreading contagiously. And the way in which he dealt with it is that in front of the god Hercules, who was the merger of man and God, right? Zeus and a human woman, by force, there's a merger, and this merger of distinction of identity is manifested in the Hercules god. And in front of that statue, Apollonius, this supposed miracle worker, whips up a crowd into going after a beggar who is looks like is pretending to be blind to avoid eye contact with the mob that's in a state of mob-like aggression and panic. And at first, the mob doesn't want to stone the person, the beggar. But Apollonius keeps egging them on until they lock eyes. But the beggar quits the blind pretending technique and opens his eyes, and they see hatred. They see hell in his eyes. Of course, this is written by the victors of this story, the way they saw it. So they're going to write it in a way that tells the history from their perspective, right? And they immediately start hurling stones at this person to the point where the person is covered in stones. And it says that they then moved the stones away, and they saw a hound dog, a hell dog from hell. A hound from hell. Again, a merger of person and animal, right? Just like that mermaid that they thought was real in Japan, and they were worshiping it to stave off the pandemic. There's always this merger of identity in these God stories that we've had in the ancient times, but we still have them to this day. And they're popping up in more direct forms now in our own culture, right? Where we're merging gender. We're merging the concept of what is something appropriate for adults and what is appropriate for children. That's being completely attacked and made to be fuzzy and fluid. And there's a merger of identity in terms of race or ethnic traditions, supposed to be attacking things that would keep diversity going and distinctions and differences celebrated. Mergers of borders. Now we're not supposed to have borders unless you're filled with hate, you're told. You need to merge the whole North American continent and the whole world. Right? Merger of religions. You can't say anything's different about your faith versus others. This merger of identity, this loss of difference, does not breed, as the fashionable gods of our age tell us, it does not breed peace. It breeds more conflict. Because when you force these things and when you create these opportunities for intense, rivalrous imitation, it leads to conflict. It leads to more and more chaos and disorder and destruction, which then is dealt with a big sacrificial imposition of force and violence from tyrants. Let's be mindful of that as we continue in this time of undifferentiation. You don't hear this anywhere else in broadcast radio. That's why we do something different on this show. But these are the big pattern things that we need to consider as we look at what we think, if we're not aware of history, are just kind of random, kind of wonky, wacky, weird things popping up. Differentiation and differences and boundaries are okay. And our gods of our culture tell us absolutely not. And that's the big issue of our time. Is that it's okay to have healthy differentiation, distinctions between male and female. Language, meaning real things, not abstractions that try to merge people into units of blobs of nothingness. Trying to obliterate the concept of human spirit and consciousness to the point where they think, oh, well, we can merge that with computers and machines. This is something we have to understand at the big picture level, that differentiation and boundaries are okay. They don't have to be warred again, given a war to try to eliminate. What we need to be focused on instead is stopping our collective violence, stopping our addiction to using force and coercion to impose our will on one another. That's the false promise of power in politics in our culture. Just use the imposition of force against your neighbor here, and that will be for the greater good. That just doesn't work. In the New World Order that has been inaugurated by Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago, he said God desires mercy, not sacrifice. He says, do not resist evil with violence. It says those who live by the sword die by the sword. And our society is living by the sword, and it will die by the sword if it doesn't stop. Having our economy based on perpetual wars and proxies and selling weapons to all kinds of despots and dictators and terrorist groups, from Azov Battalion neo-Nazis to ISIS and all these things in between. That's literally having an economy that's living by the sword of imposition, the sword of arrogance, the sword that we have the right to impose our way and our politics onto the whole world. And if we want to be on the leaders, we have to do that. That's ridiculous. That's a lie. How many times that people tell you who they say they're Christian, and they'll tell you, we have to be in Ukraine because if we don't, Putin will invade everything around the world. Where'd you get that from? You got that from people who live by the sword and die by the sword. You got that from people who say, I don't agree with Jesus. I desire sacrifice, not mercy. I don't care what you call yourself. You're not imitating Jesus when you talk that way, when you think that way, when you feel that way. You are missing the mark of what it means to master reality the way the master of history did. So it's the violence and coercion that we keep going towards, which spurs on more and more of this undifferentiation, this loss of boundaries of self and identity and distinctions. But we refuse to give up the violence, and instead we double down on using that coercion to go after distinctions and boundaries and differences. And what we need to do is reverse it. We need to stop the collective violence, stop using aggression, stop whoring after political idols, and start respecting differences and boundaries and hierarchies and differences in terms of skills and so forth. And respect that and go and stop doing the violence, you see? We've got it reversed, and we got to go the other way, the opposite way. All I see from politics and the Democrats and Republicans has become more and more alike. We saw that Trump announced he's going to start doing the mail-in ballot harvesting thing, and I don't blame him. I guess that's the way that has to be. But guess what? That's more and more alike. The parties become more and more alike. More and more alike, always promising the moon for people and doing nothing but ruining the economy. Trains are falling apart. In Kissimmee, just down the road from where we are, factories blowing up everywhere we look. It's either a destruction of a decline of our infrastructure and competence and zeal for excellence, worn down materials, worn down factories, or some bit of malice or some mixture of both. But we can't keep going this way, folks. We've got to go in a different opposite direction. We've got to embrace nonviolence and respect for human persons. That beggar that Apollonius of Tyana got the mob to stone to death didn't deserve to die. And I can respect that beggar's right to have personhood without falling into the error of individualism, where we say we're all just rugged individualists that don't need one another and we can pull ourselves up from our own bootstraps. That's not what we're saying. But that we have to reject this false dialectic that says either be a dumb, rugged individualist or be a collectivist, tribal identitarian. No, we don't have to accept that false dialectic. That's a fraud. That's a fraud of ignorance and arrogance that we have no interest in. Instead, we just need to keep our role models clear. We desire mercy, not sacrifice. We don't want undifferentiation. We want to respect boundaries and orders and differences. We want to reject sacrificial violence that leads to more and more of this chaos and breakdown between people. It's not that hard, folks. I'm giving you the big picture view. But we know this intuitively. If our conscience is not numbed out, our consciences tell us this. To do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And to reject the lie of the powers of the world that want us to continually embrace this revolutionary zeal to overthrow all boundaries and differences, which will in turn just continually keep us at each other's throats with more and more chaos, disorder, alienation, and paranoia. We don't need that, folks. We need beauty, we need truth, we need love, we need nonviolence. Back after this with James Kourtides. Welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice Radio. Happy to have this time with you. I wanted to look at this story in Zero Hedge, but before I do that, I want to bring on my guest now, who's the host of the Rooster's Crow podcast, James Kourtides. How you doing, sir?
I am well, David. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Doing great. You know, I saw this Zero Hedge story. It says, those who master artificial intelligence and synthetic biology will be master of the world. That's what Klaus Schwab said he's the chairman of the World Economic Forum during an event in Dubai. He says that technologies like AI and metaverse, cryptocurrencies, space tech, and synthetic biology will change the world. Our life in 10 years from now will be completely different, very much affected, and who masters those technologies in some way will be the master of the world. And you know what's interesting about this is that this reflects something that I've been saying a lot on this show, which is that these folks who talk these big games about technology, it's always stuff, mostly aside from, I guess, a little bit the space tech stuff, but it's mostly in the world of bits. You know, it's in the world of the mind. It's in the world of the virtual, metaverse, AI, crypto, synthetic biologies, you know, using computers to create fake limbs or, you know, maybe fake food. All this stuff is not, it's not dealing with the actual material world, like having flying cars and energy too cheap to meter and having elemental transmutation so that we don't have to have rare earth elements mined, but we can pull them out of other elements at room temperature using magnetic fields, anti-gravity, being able to have, machines and technology that doesn't need propulsion technology to move, or, you know, something more closer to Earth, like an absolute cure for cancer using dietary changes. Those are all the things we talk about on this show in terms of technology. It's all physical, incarnational truth, which I think is a reflection of a Christian worldview, which looks at actually incarnational physical solutions to meet people's needs and lack, rather than these things, metaverse. There's no real pain and suffering that metaverse is actually going to meet. AI, I mean, that's kind of ancillary in my opinion. Crypto, again, if we had real honest money, we wouldn't need to be worrying about getting into crypto, but it's just a reaction to fiat, you know. And then, you know, I guess there is some value in synthetic biology to some degree for some, you know, maybe prosthetic limbs. I don't know exactly what they're talking about, but probably not for the food sense. But how do you see that distinction there?
Yeah, I think you were seeing this all of a sudden. These open AI large language model platforms coming into the fold. The most known one is the Chat GPT platform, which I was hesitant to kind of mess around with, and I started messing around with it, and I actually became more confident in humanity based on what these AI platforms can do. They're large language models, so what this system can do is it can comb and abstract through the entire internet, all known knowledge that's uploaded to the internet, and it can parse it out and summarize it in very useful ways, but it doesn't think. It can calculate better than humanity, right? But it doesn't think. It doesn't really synthesize, right? It's got an ability to abstract, but not ability to perceive the revealed. It's not feeling what it receives. So in a way, Klaus Schwab is right, but he's right in the worst way, because the godless people that lead our nation in the world, they're going to use these tools, and they're going to say that what this AI is spitting out is the truth when it's not, right? It's their truth, and I think that's going to become kind of more obvious, right? Like you said, there's no pain and suffering. There's no experience of love when it becomes to an AI. And whether you say, eventually the technology and the processing will get so sophisticated that there's going to be a being that is that feels feelings, that seems either impossible, or if it does happen, there's a kind of phase transition that'll happen. So it's this idea of pain and suffering. I was thinking about it today. It's like in Canada and elsewhere, they're actually increasing their euthanasia programs for all ages, and they're advertising it, right? And this idea is to get rid of suffering, and that's what you hear from the moralist, the Sam Harris, who wrote The Moral Landscape, says that we need to get rid of suffering in the world. But that's where the being a human comes in, right? Eliminate pain and suffering to what end? Right? Pain and suffering is a spiritual information. It's something that it communicates to the person about some part of their essence, about their soul, about their spirit, about their relationships, about how they're structuring their lives in a sense. And it's the suffering that causes the repentance, the metanoia, the change that is necessary to grow spiritually. So ultimately, the AI, just like any technology, will be a terrible master but a wonderful slave, in a sense, if you can utilize the God-given technology, right? The logic of computer science and the logic of artificial intelligence is in God's creation. The question is, to what end? And I think it's going to be available, maybe not to the level and scale that the military has, the advanced AI and whatnot. It's going to be available to people who have hearts and souls that want to use it for good. So I think the functionality of it, just like any technology, is surprising when it comes into the fold. This is a game-changing technology. This is going to change things dramatically, but that has a double edge to it, like everything else.
Yeah, I think these fools that believe AI is going to be consciousness. I mean, look, there may be something that I think they say the most computing power altogether is barely able to match a cockroach, I mean, so obviously to some degree there might be something interesting, but the idea that it will, be able to have consciousness on level with the human, I think it just shows the plain ignorance of this materialist worldview that undergirds so much of these so-called elites. And I don't know, if they actually believe their own BS, or if they just peddle it to, the masses, thinking that they'll go along with whatever they tell them. Just like, Fauci telling everybody what he said, and he was wrong repeatedly over and over again, but he thought he had a divine right to rule by lies. But, it is interesting, though, that, again, the concept of technology has become synonymous with the world of computers, right? As opposed to, I think a more Christian society would take care of the body, The Christian societies take care of the body and soul. They don't just say, check out into AI, check out into, virtual reality. Christians say, okay, we're going to solve diabetes. We're going to solve depression. We're going to solve, you got pollution problems, we're going to solve it without using coercion or violence or government, corporate welfare or things like that,
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about it like that. What does it mean to solve diabetes, right? And each ailment, any disease, whether it's chronic or even acute fractures or whatnot, they're a manifestation of missing the mark in some way, either in an individual's life or in a collective life, right? So solving the problem is not about fixing the symptom, which is what the technology has allowed us to do masterfully, right? I think it was Stalin that had this quote that said, quantity has a quality all to itself, right? It's the idea that we can build enough processing power, enough computing power that's going to create some sort of self-reflective consciousness. Doesn't make sense. It's a confusion of terms. Right. Our minds, our spirits are made to calculate. Of course, we have intelligence. We have ability to rationalize. Right. But that is a lower level, one level of a higher spiritual tool and connection that we have. We're hyper focused because we've effaced the idea of the divine and the transcendent. We're hyper focused on this wonderful quality of the mind to calculate, and to interpolate through this, practical intelligence. But that's part of the process, right? That's half of the process. The ability to have an insight and to draw connections between what's being provided from an intellectual perspective and what it means to one's own life is mediated by the body and the relationships between people and bodies. And I think we need to continue to remember that and stay at that, because I think you're going to see a lot of people have been stripped of their faith in God. They're stripped of their faith in their nation, even in the family, right? It's no better time to unleash something that can give a false sense of meaning, right? You've seen the whole meme of being in your pod, right, with your VR goggles on, having, chemicals pumped into you. Why not? If everything, happiness is just a chemical that's produced by your body, why not cook up some kind of transmitting link that gives you the experience of orgasm or the experience of happiness all the time? And why not use some visual goggles, some virtual reality to actually experience spatially and temporally, at least apparently, these wonderful feelings that your brain is getting? But nobody, it does it. Nobody wants to do that, but there's going to be a market for that. I don't know if there's going to be a market for that. Things really open up when we think of the future 5-10 years, when we see the rapidity of what's happening and the changes that are happening today. So it's an open question, but it's like, we were talking earlier, it's a very interesting and fascinating time to be alive. And I'm blessed, and we're blessed to have the experience of being here now. Nobody got to know what happens.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. Kissimmee nursery fire, the Fox 35 Orlando says Residents concerned about air quality after fire burns hundreds of plastic pots at Kissimmee Nursery. There's a lot of other stories about different food distribution and warehouses revolving around food or the growing of food and raising of animals, having all these types of disasters. And it's hard to know, is this just something that the media, because the public is catching on to a narrative, the media keeps selectively emphasizing things that are maybe happening all the time. But I've seen other stories that say, no, this actually is occurring at a more frequent rate than in last few years than it has before. And then, of course, there's, what is it? And then you get into, is it the breakdown of meritocracy and merit and pursuing excellence? Is it a product of a culture that's not, there was a story I was reading about a particular type of pasta, the star pasta. I can't remember the name right now, but it's shaped like a little tiny star that they were having great sales with it, the pasta manufacturer, but they literally cannot find the manufacturing technology to keep it going. So they're going to have to discontinue it. But it makes you wonder, this kind of decline in industry, decline in knowledge, decline in excellence and hope for the future. Is that what's causing, these things to, factories to not be at the best state or warehouses to not be the most competently taken care of and maintaining safety standards and so forth? Is that what's behind this? And then people on the internet, of course, and so forth, jump to other thoughts like maybe there's somebody trying to sabotage this. And, at this point, people have a right to feel that way, even if that may not be true, because of how much malevolence people have seen in recent years, being so brazen.
Yeah, the ambiguity is kind of the point, David. I think you're right, and I think that what kind of I take from all of these events that are happening is the massive and rapid distrust in the state and in the media, for better or for worse, right? So there is some structure there; it's corrupt. But now, for whatever reason, nobody can trust what's coming out, or at least 50% of the population is not going to trust what happened we saw with COVID and then the max coercion vaccination campaign, and we're seeing the consequences of that. We're seeing the incursion into Ukraine and NATO and sending arms there, hundreds of billions of dollars. We're seeing, balloons being shot down, and there's a large contingent of the population that just does not buy the narrative that's coming through. And the same thing is happening with these fires. The fire in Ohio, which is right at the mouth of the Ohio River, where it's, pushing out a bunch of neurotoxins. It's actually a plastic CVC, the fundamental unit of that chemical, is being expressed everywhere. And then this fire in Kissimmee is a bunch of plastic as well, right? So it's easy for, people that are, see patterns to observe these patterns like, oh, we're under attack. There's some kind of coordinated effort, whether it's, chicken coops and big, large factory chicken farms being, exploded or destroyed, and all the stuff that's coming through our television. It's hard to make sense of, what's the significance of it happening? How much did it happen before? Is it increasing? And what does that mean? You even saw the governor of Ohio talk about that. One of the questions when the media asked him is, how did you determine if it was safe? What other areas or domains or people did you consult to determine it's safe for people to come back to their homes? And he said the military. I forgot what department it was, but they consulted with the military, right? It's like, why are you consulting with the military for this kind of feedback when the trust in the communication that's coming from any institution has been damaged really, really bad and almost completely, right? Which is so fine. You shouldn't trust them. They're crooks. But what comes next? What is the outcome if we don't even have a flawed way of making sense of the world together? So I don't know. It seems like the more technology is advancing, the less capacity we have to solve problems. And that's the paradox. In the 80s, growing up in the 80s, we're waiting for flying cars and the DeLorean and, everything kind of being, puppy dogs and ice cream. But it seems we've hit an inversion where the more technology is being advanced, the more smaller number of people are wielding its power and not using it for the greater good, right? And that just might be the way this world is, and not the way the world has always been. with wars. Yeah, I know you were talking earlier in your monologue about the state of war, and it's just my son was asking me, he's like, when was the first war? I was telling him, no, the official first war, and I said, son, war is the way the world has been. So blackmailing and doing all of these things that we see, that Azov Battalion, that's just the way it might be. So I don't know what the solution is from a political or from a state perspective. But it's not found in these structures that continue to repeat the pattern that has got them there since time immemorial.
Yeah, I mean, when you realize that the folks who seem to have a lot of the oligarchic power because they've deeply captured regulations and printing presses in the West that just print money out of thin air, supporting their industrial power or their profits. A lot of these institutions, you look at the United Nations. I saw this story from the New York Times. This is from July 24th, 1983. Population prizes from the United Nations assailed. This is the United Nations. They rewarded two $12,500 rewards given by United Nations Population Agency to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi of India and to China's family planning chief. Now, this is being denounced in this article by a U.S. economist, saying these countries use brutal methods to curb population growth. So, but you look at it, and it talks about the economist says the harm was done by awarding the prize to a public official in China, where public policy is responsible for the appallingly high rate of female infanticide, where they have that one-child policy. And a prize to the head of state of India, despite her cruel mandated sterilization. During the emergency rule she imposed on India from 1975 to 1977, Mrs. Gandhi's government was accused of forcing men in villages to undergo sterilization. China's family planning minister received the other award, uses a system of punishment for couples who have two or more children. And women carrying a second child who refuse an abortion can lose 20% of their pay. Why are we, United Nations and Klaus Schwab, that's their same they didn't lose their ideology in any ways. They got worse in some cases. So people have a right to be suspicious when they see chicken coops going up in flames and, nurseries going up in flames when we're being told to eat bugs and synthetic food. We have a right to, because these people have a long track record of giving deep rewards to people who literally sterilize through force and create forced abortions,
Yeah, it's an attractive thing to think, right? That it's kind of like the Achilles heel of liberalism in the West, of being so, turning everything and said human beings are the problem and population explosion is the problem. I've heard only until recently, the last 10 years, it was the completely accepted notion that the population is getting too big. And if it continues to get too big, we'll have resource depletion and we're not going to be able to feed people. But we've seen the opposite be the case. We've seen the population explode in the last 50 years. And we've seen a lot of the predictions that came in the 50s and 60s from the Green Movement actually inverse. There was a kind of green revolution in the 60s and the 60s and 70s that led to us coming, out of poverty at a rapid pace after the year 2000. I mean, poverty is diminishing, right? So it's like, I don't know if it's the momentum of this idea of population is too high, but people like Elon Musk and other people are saying no, population is too small. That would increase the population. I guess the question ultimately comes in when we talk about population. Like again, Stalin said that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a data point. Right? When we talk about populations, it's easy to think of people as fungible tokens, right? But when we're talking about persons and people, that makes things like abortion and population control be abhorrent, like it is if you have a heart and if you have you don't have to be Christian to see the dignity of a human being, of a child, of a baby. You don't have to be a Christian, to see what it's a fundamental, reality that we are troubling with, and we're facing a lot of trouble because that's happening, right? Because that is ultimately a sin. The biggest sin is not to see your neighbor, your fellow human being, as a worthy individual person. Once that goes, downstream, we get to see all of the lunacy that we're seeing, especially through social media, what amplifies it all.
Right. Yeah. And there's you have popular figures like, comedians and movie stars and everybody telling us don't have families, shaming people for wanting to have a bright future. We have to turn the page on this nihilism. We have to. And I don't know exactly what all the answers are to how to get that done, but we all have to come to a conclusion that we're not going to have a pro-death, anti-child culture. And I think that's a starting point to getting past this state, this era of paranoia and despair that is kind of filling into a lot of people's hearts right now.
Yeah, the problem is that the people that are, let's say, pro-abortion, right, they're not seeing it as, the death of a child or the dignity of a person. They might really believe that, but somehow something has taken over them. I don't know if it's the ideological, political capture that you can put away your actual care for human beings, which is inculcated in your person if you're alive right now, and put that to a side and before something like, mass abortions at this scale that we're in. If you really drill down to that, people will agree, abortion should be used as wholesale birth control, except even the extreme would think that. But it's a change in the way we can think about the issue that I think is the problem, and the inability to have the conversation about really what is valuable in life. What are we here to do? What's important? I think when you drill down with almost anybody, that will come to kind of the same conclusions. Right, but then the critic will pop up. Look how terrible families are. Look at divorce. Look at terrible fathers beating their wives and beating their kids. Yeah, these are all terrible things, right? But the notion of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, throwing out families as such because there's been a loss in trust in families as well. That's problematic. What are you going to replace it with? Communes? What do you think communes going to structure on based on the dynamics of familiar relationships? So it's really a really confusing and a confused time, but it was written that this would happen.
Very good, James. Always great to have you on, and check out the Rooster's Crow podcast on YouTube. Any last thoughts?
No, thank you, David. I appreciate it, and thanks for having me on. And I can't wait till next time.
Very good. We'll talk again soon, and that's it for Hour 1. We'll be back with Hour 2 of our live program. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned for more. We'll be talking with Surit, our writer at aneighborschoice.com, editor of the website, going into the culture, going into more insights about current events from a big picture perspective. We'll also touch on the topic of nutrition insights with our good friend Brad Marshall, who's scheduled in the next hour, so you don't want to miss any of that. In the meantime, go to our website at neighborschoice.com. We're going to be moving to an online-only format, so if you listen on the radio or live stream, make sure you go to our website at neighborschoice.com now and put your email in so you can make sure you get our weekly content update where we have our highlights for online-only content. I don't want you to miss out on that as we transition to an exciting new future in the next month. Stay tuned for more information about that. But for now, I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed. From the heart of Central Florida, you're listening to the most electrifying show in media. A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, your neighbor, David Gornoski. So glad to be back for Hour 2 of our program, coming to you on aneighborschoice.com, as well as FM and AM. Remember to go to subscribe to our channel on Rumble. Search for A Neighbor's Choice on Rumble and subscribe there. Or if you want audio podcasts, make sure you subscribe. Search for my name, David Gornoski, at your favorite podcast and subscribe to that podcast feed, whatever your platform of choice is, to to catch all of our program as we move into an online-only format after this month. It'll be exciting to see what happens, and I think you'll be really enjoying it. And joining me now to talk about culture and art and things related to the news from a unique perspective, we have with us writer and editor at aneighborschoice.com, Surit Dasgupta. How you doing, sir? I think we have can't hear you, so we'll try again here in a little bit. When we look at the different competing narratives right now, you'll see a lot of emphasis, as I mentioned in the previous hour with our guest, James. You'll see a lot of this emphasis on a culture of death, on a culture of narcissism coming to its full kind of maturation. I saw this story in globalnews.ca. Minors should be eligible for assisted dying, parliamentary committee says. This is a story by Teresa Wright. It says Canada's assisted dying laws should be expanded to include minors. A parliamentary committee has recommended in a report labeled or tabled in the House of Commons. After hearing from nearly 150 witnesses and reviewing more than 350 briefs on Canada's medically assisted dying, it's called MAID program, MAID, the Special Joint Committee of MPs and Senators concluded that minors deemed to have the appropriate decision-making capacity should be eligible for assisted death. A number of witnesses noted Canadian minors are already allowed to make decisions about withholding or ceasing medical treatment, even when such decisions may hasten death, while others said they felt the decision to seek MAID is simply too weighty for a minor to make. Many witnesses told the committee they strongly believed the capacity for a minor to make an informed health care decision is not a function of age, nor is the level of suffering they might endure during an illness, a view supported by clinical observations, the report said. In the end, the committee agreed that many factors can influence a minor's decision-making capacity. Therefore, it believes that eligibility for MAID should not be denied on the basis of age alone. So they want to normalize euthanasia, government-supported killing of minors in Canada. Talk about a culture of death. Let's see if we have our writer and editor from aneighborschoice.com, Surit Dasgupta. How you doing, sir?
Hello, David. How are you?
Doing well. What's your reaction when you hear this story about Global News saying that they're passing in this committee in the House of Commons in Justin Trudeau's Canada this desire to allow for minors to have assisted suicide?
Well, this is something that even the bleak dystopian movies that we've seen, even those don't come close to this. I remember seeing a movie called Logan's Run, which was a dystopian movie from the 70s where this euthanasia practice was made into kind of a sacred ritual, and nobody above the age of 30 was permitted to live. So this is taking it to the next level. It's become so anti-life that we're not content to have old age, people living in their old age, but we're also willing to, sacrifice minors at this new secular religion. So it just goes to show how if you don't have this concept of God's image in every person, in every human being, ultimately people de facto become just flesh and blood and meat basically, and there is no inherent value in humans. And we've seen how Trudeau's government has really marched ahead with this religion of progressivism, and it's not so much as successful in America because of a strong, I mean, not complete but strong sense of spirituality that exists in some parts of America, at least in outside the big cities. So this has not yet gained a stronghold in America, but if not uh, dealt with, it would take quite a stronghold here.
So, in France and other countries in Europe, they are even more radical in their embrace of euthanasia. But how in the world can we possibly even comprehend why a society needs to even exist, why a society should exist, if it's going to embrace government forced murder of or killing of minors because they don't want to live, and they're embracing this ideology of this culture of death? It's absolutely insane to even process the fact that this has now become that normalized in Canada and other places, including large population centers of America.
Well, as we mentioned, in Europe, the reason why it's this anti-life sentiment is so popular over there is because they have basically established the European Union over there, and the EU is made up of these unelected leaders, and they have no skin in the game with the actual people living on the ground. And America has to avoid that, taking that kind of political path. They have to, Trump was giving us these kind of promises that they he would not uh, fund NATO as much as America did previously. And in many ways he did kind of put a check and balance in that regards. He did not start any new wars overseas. So what I was getting at is this this vanishing of sovereignty. It's the first step. The vanishing of borders, which you alluded to in your in the previous hour. This is the first step of how these things come about. This euthanasia based culture comes about. And if you erase boundaries, if you erase all uh, inherent value in human life, if you demote humanity to just another spoke in the wheel, you end up with a very this kind of society which is stuck in bits, and which is stuck in the digital world. It's like everyone is living in an illusion. So and of course you have to take Jesus's personhood revolution to heart, because basically what Jesus did is that he started a revolution that makes it impossible for humanity to sustain itself through this anti-life philosophy that is dominant in Canada, places like Canada, and in Europe, and in also in Asia, places like China.
Yeah, and I mentioned it in the previous interview, but I wanted to get your take on this in line with what we just described with this minor, uh, trying to normalize minor suicide for Canadians. How sad. You have this story for the New York Times in 1983 where the United Nations, and I mean, I don't know, they probably did this a lot sooner and more recently too, and a lot more money in different ways with all these different foundations and so forth. But the United Nations has the same ideology as the World Economic Forum and the Gates Foundation and everything. But they're giving these $12,500 awards to folks like Prime Minister Indira Gandhi of India and to China's family planning chief, where because they were doing these heinous forced sterilization policies. Mrs. Gandhi's government did it from 1975 to 1977, forcing men in villages to undergo sterilization. And China, of course, doing their killing of so many girl babies and babies in general because of using coercive sacrifice. And that was just, they're giving awards. Good job. Keep going. What the heck? This is the same ideology that we're still living under. And you look at someone like Trudeau and all the little Muppets that he works with, and Klaus Schwab, he was very happy to have groomed Trudeau for that job at the World Economic Forum. And he's over there and presiding over a government that wants to normalize, if you're a teenager or, younger, you just go ahead and you don't want to live, we'll go ahead and help you do that.
Yeah, it's very interesting because many of these NGOs they have a history of doing this in various countries around the world, and you can see why countries like Russia and some other ex-Soviet countries they have a very strict restriction on these NGOs, how they operate in their countries. And I'm not saying that to defend the government in any way, but that depopulation sterilization campaign that you mentioned in India, there's a Vox article, if anyone can search online, they can easily find it. And it speaks about how the Ford and Rockefeller foundations funded these sterilization campaigns alongside the government of India. And most recently, we saw that Bill Gates praised the current Prime Minister Modi on his vaccination campaign during the pandemic time. And you see, this is a very common thread, common pattern around the world, whether you see it in America or anywhere else in the world, is how these oligarchs, these non-government entities are consolidating these key expert driven industries, like big pharma and big food, how they are consolidating these areas and basically running it free from public checks and balances. So the people don't have any say in how these institutions are run. It's these institutions, like the CDC, FDA, they're basically driven by oligarchic control, and it's just it's been going on for some time, I guess.
Yeah. Do you know any about that story about the policies of Indira Gandhi? I know that she was assassinated, I guess the
Right.
same year, the year after that story came out in the New York Times. But was that actually true about the forced sterilization of people in villages?
Yes, that's very much true. And this article on Vox.com is an article from 2019. The headline of that article is "The Time of Vasectomy: How American Foundations Fueled a Terrible Atrocity in India." And it speaks about these NGOs, like I already mentioned, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundation, and how they cooperated with Indira Gandhi's government to basically, uh, you know, basically take mass sterilization campaign among and this is very important. They vast majority of India's population is below at least at that time was below the poverty line. So these mass sterilization campaign was really uh, it was driven throughout the rural areas. Poor people, people just living from hand to mouth, or barely getting through the day through the daily wages or daily earnings. They were basically dragged from the streets and forced to uh, to be sterilized. And we see, and not only this is we don't really have to go that far to see this kind of behavior. Even in the recent pandemic, people in villages, they were along with the enforcement people, they were uh, held against their will, and they were vaccinated on the spot. And despite, you can find camera footage all over the internet if you look on social media, how poor people, they were screaming and shouting and struggling as people, as these government workers held them against their will, and they were vaccinated, they were injected on the spot. So this is really, I mean, you won't see this kind of force, uh, being employed in Western countries, even countries like Europe. This is out of the question in places like America, where people have a sense of liberty. But in the poor places, like in the villages of India, people don't have a sense of liberty. They just want to survive. They just want to eat, and just not starve to death. And their vulnerability has been taken advantage of to this day.
Yeah, and I don't want that kind of ideology to have a grip over the world. And I think we all should have a right to say, I don't want that. But yet we're told that we are monsters and fascists if we don't want this pathetic octopus of corporations and fascist punk thugs and eugenicists and nutcase psychopaths and government agencies working together to force people into these terrible situations all over the globe. This is not something anybody should, with a conscience, should be supporting. If you have any decency or compassion, leave people alone. And it's a sad thing that the Ford Foundation was involved in some of this stuff. I know that's a far cry from the worldview of Henry Ford, who didn't want, who was a Christian,
Exactly.
who didn't want to go along with that kind of garbage.
Yeah, and these are, I mean, it just goes to show, when there's these leftist people in the US and in the West, they praise diversity, and they want to they'll call you a bigot if you don't cooperate with these big corporations, with these oligarchs, and these uh, government institutions. But you just have to bring them to bring their attention to stories like these, because the same oligarchic powers, the same corporatists that they support, it's the same government institutions, the same EU and all these people that they support. These same people are wreaking havoc in the poor places of countries like India and China. And it just goes to show how ignorant and how hypocritical that these people are, these leftists who only focus on diversity and so superficiality of tolerance in the West. But the very same institutions that they support, they are rampant, and they exploit other countries, and and so on.
Yeah, it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. I can wear a T-shirt for Eric Garner and do nothing to stop the law that the New York State barbaric government continues to put in place against selling cigarettes in an unlicensed manner that got him killed. But they don't do anything to stop the genocide of the Yemeni people in Yemen that Biden and Obama and Trump continued that too. But they talk a big game about how they're the party of multiculturalism, but they really are very bigoted and disgusting in their foreign policy and even domestic policy for that matter. And we've got to be able to push back. We've got to have a culture of life. And it's not pushing back. That's a reactionary language. I don't want to use that kind of language. I want to push forward and go into a positive solution perspective. I saw Chelsea Handler, the comedian. She keeps pushing. I think she must be getting an agenda or something, because she keeps pushing every day how happy she is. She's really desperate to show how happy she is that she didn't have kids. And somebody named Jared Monroe responded to her latest video they put out about how she's so happy to have kids so she can have self-love and she can sleep into 12:30 in the afternoon. And He said, if you want to live a meaningless life void of courage and joy, that's your right, but stop selling it to kids and young adults as if you're happy with your life choices. You're not. And most of us know it. And that doesn't mean that, everybody is called to have families, but it just shows you cannot literally have a civilization if people are told there's no point in having families. You can't have a civilization if you're told, yeah, we should normalize kids wanting to end their life with government support. You can't have a society where people are not allowed to make medical choices, but they have to be forced into doing things that could harm them viciously. You just can't. And that's the choice. It's be a pro-human future or an anti-human future.
Exactly, and basically what we need to do is to make ourselves independent from all of these institutions. Just focus on strengthening our own local communities, so that we don't need the help, the so-called help from these institutions, these terrible people who want to herd us, manage us like sheep and cattle. And like you said, we have to look closer to home. We have to look close to our families. We have to strengthen our families. We have to we have to make babies as much as possible. And this is it's a birth is not something that is evil. Birth is something that is beautiful. Create It's really hand in hand with creativity, because we are using God's creative energy when we are giving birth. And this is what we have to focus to, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's something diabolical about being at war with the womb, like so much of our institutional, tastemakers seem to be. They hate the concept of life, and obviously, not everybody has that calling to have a family or whatever, and that doesn't make them any less than anybody else. But there's certainly something sick and depressing about embracing disregard for human life. So thanks again, sir, for joining us. It's always great to have you on.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We're going to change gears and talk about the science of nutrition, seed oils, health, improving your life, understanding how vitamins and different things work in your body. Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss this. It's exciting. It's going to be great to hear from our guest, Brad Marshall.